Hey everyone, I got my hands on this piece of heavyweight craft paper, and I've also got this photograph that I took last summer. A cozy looking old house, tucked into the trees, perfect for a sketch. I start with the peak of the house, and then quickly lay in some rough perspective lines. That front gable is really interesting, so I get that in early and make sure I have enough room for all that filigree detail there, then following my loose perspective lines for the porch roof, and then from there I can build the porch itself, measuring vertically to make sure these posts line up with where they do in the photo. The tree on the left here is mostly important to me compositionally. Trees have a lot of deep, dark shadows, which are darker than the shadows on the house itself. Let me show you what I mean here with a little diagram. It's good practice to begin by grouping your shadows together, but eventually that limits how much dimension you can get. You'll get a lot more punch if you observe different levels of brightness within the shadows. This is of course related to how light actually works, which I'll talk about once we're a bit further in the painting. Alright, speaking of paint, here's my set of watercolors. Now these paints came out of the tube originally, and have since dried on that palette, so I'm reactivating them with water. And here's my first color mixture. This will be for the bricks of the house. I didn't clean my palette, I'm working into whatever was there from before. It was a neutral gray, which is a mixture of warms and cools, that I am now steering warmer with the addition of reds, oranges, and yellows. There's a good helping of water on my brush too, which will ensure that this doesn't dry too dark. The first pass with watercolor is always your colors in light. This will set us up for a shadow pass later. This is the color mixture for the rooftops. Now that's a bit too cool, so I'll warm it up with some red. Building your colors out from gray like this really helps ensure color harmony. This is because every color has gray in common. So building out from there gives your colors a common home base to relate back to. So I'm still painting my light colors, and here I'm mixing up a generic sunlit green, using blues, yellows, oranges, and a bit of sap green there, but I'll favor the warm colors to make sure this green is on the warm side. Being watercolor, it's also a transparent pigment, so the base warmth of the paper itself will help me achieve sunlight. Now, it doesn't look like sunlight yet. It will when I add shadows. So this is all setup work. Okay, because I'm working on toned paper, I do have some white gouache on the palette. This will help me paint the very light road and some of the detail on the house, and there's a bit of it in the grass too. But regardless of medium, what will make the effect of sunlight believable color-wise is making sure that all my sunlit colors are bound by a similar warmth. I'm simply inventing a spot for the sun color, somewhere here, and then from there, making sure any color I use, orange for the bricks, green for the grass, hovers toward that point. Now, ironically, that almost makes the colors look uninteresting at this stage, but it is true to life, and it'll pay off once I add shadows. Alright, so this is my white gouache. Actually, it's poster color. I'll use it straight out of the tube to paint the filigree on this house. I'm trying to keep the strokes calligraphic and quick. I'm only giving myself one shot at each section. This will help capture the effortless beauty of that pattern. Single strokes all the way through here. I'm not going to start counting the number of spindles, it's just a pattern. With the opaque white on my palette, and mixing in some cobalt turquoise and cobalt blue, I'll throw in a blue for the sky. I like keeping this transparent to allow some of the warm paper to show through the blue. That'll give your sky a temperature change that is actually realistic. I have a whole lesson about painting skies. There's a link on the screen right now. Alright, it's time to add that shadow pass. This is where the colors will start jumping to life. And these first few brushstrokes don't really look like shadow, do they? I'm a little light with my mix, so I'll darken it up. But I know from experience that this will dry darker. So I'm going to start here, and I'm working quickly so it doesn't dry. Shadows have a lot of variety in them, and the time to capture that is while the wash is wet. So I'm embarking on a whole time-dependent sequence here. First I'll darken my wash a bit more, and I'll put that wherever shadows go on the house. My mixture here may appear too cold at this stage, but remember that the warmth of the pigment that's already there will show through the transparent watercolor. With watercolor, you don't mix the color you want to see, you mix the color that should mix on the page. So right at the deepest crevice of these shadows is a very dark value called ambient occlusion. It's where that skylight, the ambient light, cannot get to. So that color gets a lot warmer because there's no blue influence from the sky. And it goes down wet into wet, so the watercolor can manage the blending for me. Alright, we're getting somewhere now. And we'll continue this right after I tell you about this video's sponsor. Getting better at art is challenging. It takes a lot of alone time, which means you're going to be inside your own head a lot. And I've had students over the years tell me that that can challenge basic needs like day-to-day happiness. And that's why I'm proud to present today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and accessible. By filling out a few simple questions, BetterHelp can match you with a professional therapist within days. It's easy. There are different options to schedule sessions based on your preferences and level of comfort. Because it's a remote and online service, you can even text your therapist at any time. There's a link in the video description. It's betterhelp.com/Marco Bucci. Using that link will get you 10% off your first month. That gives you time to connect with a therapist and see if it's the right match for you. If it's not the right match, which happens, you can switch to a new one with no hassles or complications with insurance or anything like that. I know firsthand that it helps to talk to someone about your state of mind, especially in a world whose future is as uncertain as it is for artists. If you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Marco Bucci. And thank you, BetterHelp, for supporting my channel. Returning now to this mixture here, that is not the sky, it's the white parts of the house in shadow. White objects in shadow will get all their color from the ambient light, and in this case, that's the sky. In the photograph, that blue is countered by warmer reflected light, greens and oranges, also bouncing up into the whites in shadow. I'm choosing to ignore that though, because I think that saturated blue will make for a punchier color statement. Alright, continuing with that dark ambient occlusion mix, I mixed up some more of it for the inside of the windows. It's really only when you get your darkest darks in the picture that your lighting begins to pop. I like to have fun with my darks and make them chromatic darks. That means it's not just black, even the darks have warms and cools. So you just saw me dip into some pure cadmium red, and that was with the dark mixture already on my brush. So now I'm just spotting around this really intensely saturated dark red. Now, nature will be more subtle than that. So this is an example of how you can caricature light and color to arrive at something you find aesthetically pleasing. A good caricature is based on reality. In this case, it's the observation that black isn't just black. If you mix your darks all with the same black, you'll lose that critical sense of color-temperature relationships, warms versus cools. And that's why it's very common painting advice to just not have black on your palette. It forces you to mix it chromatically, which is the same way you mix any other color, like this color mix here. I'm cooling off that warm by mixing it in with that blue, and that will give me some cool shadows that I can lay onto the rooftop. When you're putting lots of similar shapes side by side in your painting like this, it's critical to make sure they're not repetitive. The human eye notices nothing quicker than repetition. And it's a big part of your training as an artist to train your muscle memory not to do that. Trying to twist and splay that brush to help paint these hedges. These little small shadow shapes I'm adding here are not in the photograph. I mean, there are shadows in the photo there, but I've redesigned mine to be much smaller shapes and more of them. That has everything to do with composition. I've been very aware this whole time that the house, which is my focal point, is mostly composed of big and medium-sized shapes. And that's great. Big shapes can anchor a picture compositionally. However, a composition really needs small shapes to feel complete. And because small shapes take up less physical space on the canvas, you can add many, many more of them to a picture than the bigger shapes. That's why I've been so okay with just leaving that big blank spot on the left of my painting. A big tree goes there, but it's not just a tree. It serves the picture compositionally in two ways. First is that dark value I mentioned earlier. I scribbled that in with pencil originally, and now I'm finally replacing it with paint. The mixture, by the way, is the same dark mix I used for the ambient occlusion areas of the house. But as you can see, my brain is still thinking about small shapes here, and that's the second thing the big tree on the left will bring to this picture. Many more opportunities for small shapes. So I'll first mix up a generic light green wash. This will be the tree in sunlight. And keeping the wash very wet, I'll once again do my best to create non-repetitive strokes that represent the different masses of foliage. And while that wash is wet, I'll throw in a few different greens and let the watercolor do what it wants to do. And while I'm here, I'll work wet over dry on this tree to start building out its forms and small shapes. If you can see the tree trunk through the foliage, treat that as just a dark accent, and painting that kind of thing wet into wet will help it feel like it sits within the tree. And now that the tree on the left is dry, apologies for the focus issues here, by the way, I'm putting in, once again, a series of small shapes. I'm much more concerned with shape composition here than tree structure. I'm varying the color while the wash is still wet, as you've seen a few times now. But drawing-wise, I'm being very careful where the tree meets the house, because that's how I'll give the house its final silhouette. Remember to stand back from your work and take stock of it from a distance. After all, this is how a regular viewer will see your painting. Structurally, that tree on the left is designed like a sphere. You know, darker at the bottom, lighter at the top. With a very light wash here, I'm changing color temperature. I want those bricks to be a bit warmer, particularly under the porch where there will be less light from the sky. Using a bit of white gouache in the mix to add opacity, I can paint in the wooden fence that sits in front of the tree. That fence is yet another opportunity for small shapes. And that compositional design is way more important to me than rendering the fence. There's the porch in light, a clear plane to support some of that reflected light. And while I have a fresh bit of gouache on the palette, here's a mixture with some of that opacity added, and I'll start by spattering it and just adding little leaves that happen to be caught by light. Once again, creating small shapes that lay over top of the bigger shapes behind them. Remember, you can have exponentially more small shapes in a composition, as compared to your medium and larger shapes. And just as a final touch, I pulled some of this off the shelf. This poster color is very much like gouache, by the way. Just using it to enhance some areas of contrast right around the focal point. One last bit of pop. So once I feel like I've got everything we discussed in this lesson in balance, I do a once-over like this. That's when I call it finished. And now we get to do the best part, peeling off the tape. I get a lot of questions about this tape. First, it's electrical tape, and the next question is, how do you get it to not tear up the paper? And here's the biggest secret of this whole video. Stick the tape to your clothing first. And there's the result of our fun little sketch session. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, I have longer premium lessons at marcobucciartstore.com. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.